Okay, hello and welcome to today's webinar hosted by Rails-to-Trails Conservancy. My name is Andrew Dupuy. I'm the Director of State Level Policy here at RTC.
And I'm Brian Hausch. I'm our Midwest Policy Manager for Rails-to-Trails Conservancy.
Our topic today is biking, walking, and trail funding, best practices for 2023 legislative sessions and beyond. With most states' legislative sessions kicking off right after the new year, we hope this presentation will help you effectively advocate for state-generated funding of active transportation networks and trails, whether you're a novice or an expert in the world of state legislatures and policy. Before I introduce our panelists, I wanted to just take a moment to go through some brief housekeeping. First, attendees have been automatically muted as they join to keep background noise at a minimum. You will not be able to speak during today's webinar. We'll be keeping an eye out for any tech issues that may emerge on our end, but we will be unable to help you with individual technical problems. If you experience any such problem, your best course of action is to contact Zoom's free customer support directly. If you lose the webinar connection, just please re-click your login link. You will be able to rejoin the ongoing session at any time. Also, if you have internet connection problems, you can use your phone to dial into the meeting and you will be able to listen. We are recording this webinar, so worst case scenario, you'll always be able to view it later. We'll save ample time for questions at the end. If you have any questions about our resources or other content you'll hear in the presentation, please type them in the question box on the right-hand side of your screen at any time. After today's webinar, you'll receive a follow-up email with a survey asking you to rate today's webinar along with a link to the webinar recording. It will include information about RTC's policy work with a link to sign up for occasional email notices from us. And with that, I'd like to introduce our guest panelists. Yumeno Young is currently the District Office Director and Chief of Staff for State Representative Greg Vitale in Pennsylvania. Prior to her move to Pennsylvania, Yumeno served as the legislative aide for an Ohio State representative who was a co-chair of Ohio's Legislative Trails Caucus. We also have Palmer McIntyre. Palmer is a conservation planner with Piedmont Land Conservancy and is currently serving as coordinator for the North Carolina Great Trail State Coalition and director for North Carolina Year of the Trail. As we get going, feel free to drop questions or comments in the Q&A for a discussion at the end. And with that, I'll turn it over to Brian to ask the panelists our first question.
All right, thanks, Drew. And also, thank you, Palmer and Yumeno, for being here. Very exciting. And I've really enjoyed working with both of you. And I thought it might be good just to start off with, if you could both share a little bit more about yourself and your professional background, particularly some of the things that you're focused on right now. And Palmer, maybe we'll start with you.
Great. Thank you, Brian. My name is Palmer McIntyre, and I work with the Piedmont Land Conservancy. I'm a conservation planner with Piedmont Land Conservancy. We're a regional land trust, so we do land conservation work in central North Carolina. And about 10 years ago, we launched a regional trails initiative with our local council of governments, and that initiative is called Piedmont Legacy Trails. And the purpose of that initiative was to brand and promote trails across our region. We have active social media. We have a trail finding map on our website. We publish trail guides. We also wanted to be a collective voice for trails as trails are planned and constructed through the region. And one of the services we provide is an annual trails summit. So it's like a conference. And several years ago, we held just a discussion about moving the needle on trails in our region at our conference. And the conversation really drilled down to resources. And the ask was, how can we get more resources for trails? And that led to our Piedmont Legacy Trails group looking to the state and partnering with groups at the state level to see how can we speak across the state and ask North Carolina as a state to invest in trails. And that led to the formation of the Great Trails State Coalition that I'll talk about in a few minutes.
Great. And I will definitely say, as folks are going to learn, you have really moved the needle, you and the group. And it's also been really impressive that you did such a good job of finding the resources that Rails-to-Trails and other groups put out there. So great to have you here. Yumeno.
Hi, yes, I'm Yumeno. I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. I graduated from the Ohio State University, and then I began working as the legislative assistant to Representative Catherine D. Ingram. who is the co-chair of the Ohio Trails Caucus. I moved to Pennsylvania this summer and began a position with Representative Greg Vitale. He is the Democratic chairman of the Environmental Resources Committee. And with a change of leadership, we'll be moving into the majority in the House. So it's going to be an exciting change. With the Ohio Trails Caucus, I attended and helped with advocacy meetings, and we planned a Trails Day, which I hope inspires some other action later. And I'm excited to share more about my work with the caucus.
Well, we appreciate you, Yumeno, and I just always reflect on how great of a strategist you are, and figuring out like how to make things work. Especially that last caucus meeting where we almost got kicked out of the room. So glad you're here, Drew.
Yes, so Yumeno, I'm really excited. As a former state legislative staffer myself, I'm excited to have you here, just having a unique perspective of having worked in 2 different state legislatures. That's not very common. And so from you, I just wanted to hear a little bit more about some of the policy work around trails, funding trails, and from Palmer, just a little bit more about the legislative work that you've done so far. So we'll start with Yumeno.
Yes, the Trails Caucus was a really great group to work with. Brian and the Ohio Trails Partnership President Steve Walker couldn't have made it easier for me. And I think that is reflected in the amount of ODNR funding and a lot of the community projects that were funded, especially in the Hamilton County area in the last capital budget session. I believe ODNR, Hamilton County received over 8 million, almost 9 million in that funding, which is a great investment. And I saw both sides of advocates coming into Rep. Ingram's office to share their projects and why things were so important. And it was great to connect with everyone at the Advocacy Day, bringing together legislators from across the aisle and making for great conversation.
Brian.
Palmer, were you gonna?
Sure.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
That's fine. I just want to take a moment to talk a little bit more about the Great Trail State Coalition. And this is that statewide initiative that we decided to form in order to figure out how to get more resources for trails in North Carolina. And really, we are solely focused on sustained state support for trails. And the reason why is because North Carolina historically has not directly invested in trails. A lot of the funding for trails has been federal pass-through dollars, either through DOT or through the Recreational Trails Program. And so we're guided by partners at Rails-to-Trails Conservancy and, pulling out from all those resources about people who've done this before us. And we gathered all our partners, particularly nonprofit organizations that were engaged in trails. We also had some local government partners, and we pulled in industry partners as well. These are entities, businesses that are involved in planning and constructing trails. And we just started to build the framework for the coalition, and there's certain pieces to it because we knew we were going to go ask for money, but we had to have a website. So we built that with data. And in North Carolina, we're really lucky to have some good studies that our Department of Transportation has invested in and a research institute at North Carolina State University. So we have some real data that tells you that trails are an investment that gives a high return on that investment, because we knew that we had to approach this from an economic standpoint with our legislators. So we got people to join the coalition. We collected dues. We hired a lobbyist, and we pulled together what our ask is, which was for big money. And then in the next question, I'll respond to as what we've achieved. But that's the whole formation process of the coalition, was just a lot of building things that we need and tools we need to make things happen.
And I really appreciate, Palmer, 2 things that you highlighted. One is how important the economic aspect of what trails, walking, biking infrastructure bring to states, communities, and so forth. Of course, there are a lot of other benefits, but that's a critical one to drill down on. And secondly, we're going to talk about tactics later, but we've been working on statewide economic impact studies for trails to really provide that making the case data. And I think it's one of the tactics that you guys figured out early on. So it's great. So I wanted to shift to hearing a little bit about a success story that resonates with you, that I think our attendees could, kind of, I guess, get more visionary around and think about some of the things that can really happen. And yeah, Palmer, I think we'll start with you.
Sure. So, we're a relatively new coalition. We really formed in 2020. So we're new to the scene. We're not even a nonprofit. We're truly a coalition. We have a fiscal sponsor that's handling the money aspects of it. But we went into the 2021 long session with our General Assembly with some asks, and we were strategic about it. So we had done some research after talking to you all at Rails-to-Trails Conservancy, and we'd seen that a couple other states had done this thing called Year of the Trail. And we thought, oh, that sounds like a really good idea. And so we went into that 2021 long session first with an ask for the state to designate 2023 as North Carolina Year of the Trail. Randomly selected the year 2023. It just seemed like the timeline was enough time for us to get organized. And it was a non-big election year, so we knew there might be, we wouldn't be distracted by politics. And so we asked for that. We got that. It was overwhelmingly passed in both houses. It was unanimous in our House, and nearly unanimous in the Senate, except just one vote that was a nay vote. And we just like to say maybe that was the wrong button being pushed. But, we just felt like it was tremendously a positive experience to get that Year of the Trail bill passed. And then we jumped into planning mode, and we'll share more about that in a few minutes. The other thing, we followed that up with an ask for money. And so we did ask for funding for trails. What came out was significant funding, which was super exciting, historic levels of funding in North Carolina for trails. But they created this, what's called the Complete the Trails Fund. And in North Carolina, we have 12 authorized state trails. So these are trails that the General Assembly has said they kind of represent the diversity of landscapes that North Carolina has to offer, like the best of the best. And so they created this fund called Complete the Trails with $29 million, but specifically for these state trails, not other trails, and specifically for natural surface portions of these 12 state trails. So there's a bit of a narrow applicability of this funding. So the coalition remains committed to securing funding for all types of trails, and we'll continue to work on that.
All right, well, thank you, Palmer. And yeah, we'll say the Year of the Trails. As Yumeno knows, that was how we kicked off the Ohio Legislative Trails Caucus. And it was a great way for folks to rally around something that's bipartisan, that's good for everybody. And so Yumeno, I'd love to hear what you think was a success story from your role in the caucus in Ohio.
Yes, I think that planning an advocacy day is very difficult. I can only imagine if I didn't have the contacts in the House to help us secure a place and things like that. But you all came with a very defined action plan. The Rails-to-Trails, but the Ohio Trails Caucus had an advocacy day. Everyone had very defined goals. They worked with their legislators to make sure those goals were attainable and that the advocates were making reasonable asks, very solid asks. And that resulted, I think, in a lot of funding in public areas. Even after the pandemic, when there was a large investment in trails, just keeping that going, showing that it's not only a place to go when we had to stay inside, but a place that we should come back together and reunite at.
Yeah, and I remember we were scrambling to make extra copies because we had like 92 meetings that day. So yeah, thank you.
So we want to learn from things that didn't work as well as things that were successful. So wanted to ask both of you for some lessons learned for something that didn't work. It doesn't have to be trail or active transportation related. I think in Yumeno's case, it could also just be what you see from the point of view as a staffer. What kind of advocacy do you think falls flat? So again, we'll start with Yumeno and then Palmer.
Yeah, so we've said it a few times now, having an ask is really important, and it has to be something direct. Your representative has limited time, but they do want to help you with what you're trying to achieve. So having a story that you can connect with them with, followed up by a direct ask that is achievable for them, whether that's writing another legislator, joining their state's caucus, forming a caucus, or supporting a budget item. you're going to want to let them know that in a concise manner. And that takes practice and also just communicating with others and using the resources that are provided by groups like the Rails-to-Trails.
Yeah, I when I was a staffer, I would often have people come in and talk about things that sounded great, but they didn't know what they wanted me to do. And that was really frustrating and not be able to help them. Palmer?
Yeah, thanks. Well, coalition work is hard. It's all about the rising tide lifts all ships, and sticking together can be hard because we're really trying to shift away from earmarks and individual projects and trying to stay in the same lane for the good of all. Another challenge has been just building credibility since we are relatively new. So it's developing those relationships with our legislative champions. We do have some champions who have stepped up in our legislature, and we're very fortunate to have that. I mean, having, a lobbyist has been absolutely critical to help represent the coalition in Raleigh. But one of the things we're working on, I think when I talked about the structure of our coalition, we have the three legs to our stool: the nonprofits, the industry partners, and the local government leg. And we're really building the local government leg very intentionally right now, because we really believe that the General Assembly will listen more to elected leaders from the local communities than they will to a group of nonprofits. So we feel like that's a super important direction for us. And, we're building a movement. I mean, we're in this for the long haul. We do have our early successes, and we're hoping for some funding success in the upcoming long session in 2023. But it really is about building a movement that's long term. And just something to add real quick. I mean, North Carolina was the good road state. We have that reputation. It's something that's kind of commonly known, but we want to be the great trail state. So that's why we're kind of working on some branding aspects there.
Nice. So Yumeno, a question specifically for you, and it kind of relates to, things that don't always go so well. You've talked about a lot of the positives with the caucus. I wonder if there were any challenges, downsides that you might want to share for folks to sort of get some takeaways.
It does come from collective action. The caucus luckily had great leaders, but that can be a lot for two people to organize all the activity. So a lot of times taking initiative and reaching out to your legislator, your elected official, building that connection with them so that you can put yourself in the best position to be a great advocate for your organization. Sometimes I think we want to just hop on the call, we'll listen, and then we wait for the next call, and we wait for the next call. But, taking the things that they're giving to you and the resources and really giving back is how we'll all get more funding for the trails. The stories that you share are also the power behind these groups, and they're wanting to share those stories with your legislators. So let them know that you enjoy a trail. They set you up for success. There's a story bank that you can make your own story about a trail while also providing very important information that your legislator might need to look into investments in that area.
Yeah, I love several things you talked about. One is, you got to build relationships. And so I think a lot of times advocates just pop in and don't realize that, it takes some time and investment to, really kind of build, and Palmer mentioned it as well, that trust. We also, related to the story bank, we thought we'd share another term for that, a story map that we used for advocacy with a recent federal grant, which I think told had a very powerful message. And so I really appreciate you sharing that and really highlighting that while a lot of times it feels scary to talk to your legislators, they do just really want to hear those stories. So thanks.
So the next one's for Palmer. And you already touched on some of the challenges and opportunities about coalition building. And I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. Perhaps who you reached out to be in the Great Trail State Coalition, and since you're the coordinator, any challenges in terms of managing all those different groups?
Yeah, good question. And one of the things I think, Jip, with this opportunity, I mean, it's such a watershed moment for trails right now on the heels of the pandemic and all the focused attention on the outdoor economy. I mean, I think there's always studies coming out saying what percentage of the overall GDP outdoor recreation is. So it really is truly a watershed moment. And this year of the trail, and again, so grateful to RTC for just supporting our effort in that. But this year, the trail is such a huge opportunity, and any state could do it, but it's a huge opportunity. And it's also a legislative strategy. I mean, it's this celebration of trails, and we're going in big. I mean, this is $1 million project that we're investing in with Year of the Trail through social media and our website and public television productions and all kinds of stuff. And so everyone's gonna get really excited about trails, but we're coming in behind with an ask for money from our General Assembly. And really we're trying to activate a whole statewide group of trail users so that they'll communicate with their legislative leaders when it comes time for that big ask. And we've invested in some toolkits for local communities so they can really become advocates for trails at the local level. Then we're asking people to invite legislators to their Year of the Trail events and all kinds of things. But yeah, so in managing the challenges of managing the coalition, so I'm a coordinator for the coalition, and what that means is I just kind of, in the back office, I like to say, I'm not the front office, I'm the back office. I just kind of keep the meetings and everything going. But it is hard work to keep this 50+ group together. We have to decide on our budgets and our legislative asks and just keep the communications going with it. So that it's a lot of work, but I feel very confident that this investment of time and resources is going to help pay off for the whole state.
All right. Thanks, Palmer.
Yeah, and I think that, maybe this is kind of a follow-up, but, you mentioned, I mean, the iron is hot. Are there any other opportunities that you are seeing that advocates should be thinking about that you want to emphasize?
Well, I mean, I think opportunities are getting your elected leaders involved in trails. And so wherever there's a trail opening or a celebration of something in any community where there's a trail event, invite those legislators to it so they can see it and feel it. And I mean, maybe this is kind of leading into the next question a little bit, but I mean, politics are really local, and it's important that these leaders see the impacts of trails in their districts, and they don't always see that. So it's really about getting them out on the trails.
Yeah, it's such an excellent point. And I really think that intersection between local, state, and federal is huge right now. How about you, Yumeno? What do you think are the key opportunities from your viewpoint?
Yes, inviting your legislators to do things, inviting their staff to do things. If you put and staff, they might not be able to go, and most likely they might ask me to go or someone else in our office. Invite their families. I know a lot of things can be family friendly, especially when they're outdoors. Or invite them to do an alternative action if they can't come. Say, if you can't come, could you please consider sharing this event with other legislators in your area or on your newsletter. I know we do that often in my office here in Pennsylvania. And in Pennsylvania, and every year there's a new General Assembly, there's a new opportunity to reconnect with your legislator. Just remind them, hi, I'm your constituent. I want to make sure I'm passionate about these areas. And then you set yourself up for a better second contact or third contact or whatever you have there.
I'm so glad you emphasized the importance of engaging staffers, because I think a lot of times, I've worked with folks that are like, if I don't get a meeting with the representative or the senator, and they don't realize that it's just as important to build that relationship with legislative aides, which I've learned. So thank you. All right, Drew.
And so the last question, and just to wrap up, is what are the approaches you think engage and motivate decision makers the most? Let's start with Palmer this time.
We're really focusing on partnerships, like deepening our bench, if you will, of the coalition. I mentioned with our local government partners, trying to build up that sector of membership in the coalition. So, asking them to join. But also we've connected with our industry partners in a big way, and the American Council of Engineering Companies, they're a big partner in our coalition, and they have a pretty big following at the General Assembly. I mean, they have a lot of connections at the General Assembly. So I think just finding other groups to adopt our platform is a big strategy for us. So it's not just us speaking on our own. And so we are branching out to additional partnerships.
Okay, thanks. Yumeno?
Yeah, I would second that. I think that's great advice. The larger your coalition is, the greater chance someone has a one-off connection or a good relationship with someone who could really push your message where you need it to go. Also, the coalitions really, they are the firsthand knowledge of what the representative is advocating for, what their constituency wants to see. So really just coming together and being the funnel of information is going to be the great opportunity. And like I said, this new General Assembly brings you the opportunity to reconnect, restart, but really champion what you've done already, because your legislators like to see things in their district.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you both so much. That was a really interesting discussion. Again, thanks to our guest panelists, Yumeno and Palmer, for their insights. I hope they can stick around at the end for the Q&A session. So we just heard from Palmer and Yumeno about their work in North Carolina, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. But we know that we have attendees here from all over the US. Brian and I are going to give a short presentation now about some of the lessons we've learned from advocating for active transportation networks and trails in many, many states around the country. And hopefully this will give the audience some new ideas of how and what to advocate for in their own state. So there we go. Great.
All right. And, I think, when you look at the title on this initial slide, I don't know, it kind of gives me goosebumps every time I look at it. But I mean, the reality is, and Palmer referenced this, we're at an unprecedented moment, in terms of just, funding for a lot of things, but, specifically appreciation around the need to have safe places to recreate. And walking, biking trails have been huge. And while more than 10% of this number is based on some things that have been going on in California, one of the things that we are seeing is that smaller states and just states in general are doing a lot of incredible things. I mean, including, and we'll talk about this in our case study piece, states like Indiana investing $60 million from their American Rescue Plan dollars to support trails and connectivity and that sort of thing. Safety is really a major focus, not just of federal funding these days, but I think it's something that really will resonate with your decision makers as much as the economic development piece. And there also are aspects of, and of course, your message is going to be customized to who you're speaking to, but equity and meaningful action related to climate change are also very important factors that help you download federal funds, which also integrate into some of the things that we're seeing on the state level. Many of you have probably kept up to date with the bipartisan infrastructure law. And, we're seeing some really exciting things there. The fact that transportation alternatives is seeing on average 70% increase over the next 5 years means a lot more projects can be funded that really, support all ages, all abilities, and many of the things that people are looking for related to quality of life. So the time is definitely now, and we're going to share with you a few case studies. I think Drew's got the first two.
Thanks, Brian. As Brian said, we're just going to touch on a few. If you have specific questions about certain states, you can always ask us, follow up with us afterwards. So first, New York is an example. It's a little less, it's a little more executive than legislative. A few years back, the New York governor at the time, I won't say their name, they announced a plan during their State of the State address, much like the State of the Union, to seek $750 million to complete a cross-state trail called the Empire State Trail. It actually crosses the state twice in 2 different directions. So it's a real destination signature trail. And it was really spearheaded from the executive office at the beginning of session, but still required legislative buy-in to appropriate the funds. And that was successful, and it has been effectively completed. You can find things about the Empire State Trail online. And I just wanted to highlight that because it doesn't just have to go through legislators, it can go through the executive. And another way that you can go through the executive is through governor's budgets, and different states have different words for this. When I worked in Texas, it was called the Legislative Budget Board budget, but it comes out before legislative session. And if they sort of have the proposed budget, and that can really set the table for better funding. A good example in that was in Virginia about a year ago, where the outgoing governor proposed $250 million for trails. And it didn't end up being quite that much, but it still ended up being $93 million for trails. And this was out of Virginia is a bipartisan state. There's a Republican governor, and one chamber is Republican and one chamber is Democratic. And I don't know that would have happened had the governor's budget not set the bar so high. So another example we always point to, and I think somebody's going to put a link in the chat to this, California has just an unparalleled program called the Active Transportation Program. And I mean, they just upped it by another $1 billion, billion with a B. And so California is just really in a league of its own in terms of trail and active transportation funding. What they did some years ago, and you can see the link in the chat to this, is consolidated all the different programs that they administer, including ones that come down from the federal government and their state generated funds. And it not only made it easier and more streamlined for local officials to apply for some of these, rather than having to apply piecemeal for small funding sources, but it's really just created a great target for more money to be put into this big, increasingly growing fund. And although realistically, I don't know that every state's going to be able to rival California's just level of investment, any state could take this model. A few years ago, we helped Minnesota do this and create kind of that consolidated bucket concept that was modeled in California. And it can really, enable local governments to better navigate the application process and just, again, be a bigger target to put active transportation funding into. So now Brian's going to talk about some Midwest examples.
Yeah, so I'll say, being the Midwest policy manager, I focus on around 9 states, and we've been able to create several replicable models that are starting to take off in other places. But I referenced Indiana before, and one of the things that's been really interesting about Indiana's trajectory is they started with a governor-appointed trails task force that identified opportunities, worked on this visionary trails concept. They even thought about kind of the idea of an Indy 500 sort of circling the state so that other trail networks could attach to that. And then they realized a legislative trails caucus could make a huge difference. And I sort of noted the date here because the launch coincided with the lockdown that many of us experienced, but at the same time, this group continued to expand. And the caucus is very bipartisan. We've got both senators and representatives, and they really, I mentioned replicable models. They adopted a lot of the strategies that Ohio had used and other states are looking at as well. Ohio's caucus has been coming up on 6 years. And one of the things Indiana did was a year of the trails. And as Palmer mentioned earlier, this is a major advocacy strategy. That resolution for Year of the Trails is not just about trails make me happy, but trails make a big difference in terms of economy, health, safety, recreation, et cetera. So then some really interesting things that happened in the context. Indiana has a Next Level Trails program that was initially funded with $90 million. very focused on connectivity. About a year and a half ago, the governor and the legislature worked together to invest another 60 million of their American Rescue Plan dollars. I mentioned that earlier, and it's been amazing. Moving forward, legislative focuses are on maintenance, which is something I know is challenging for everyone to fund, building agency capacity, and also a statewide economic impact study to help, again, develop that make the case data. Wisconsin is another great story. We're also cultivating a Trails caucus there. There's been a lot of focus on equitable development, and in particular, thinking about concepts around, we've seen the federal funding program around reconnecting communities that were broken up because of highways and other aspects, and really kind of building more of a safe, active transportation infrastructure, excuse me, that also builds on community and neighborhoods, and again, connecting people to places and opportunities. So one of the main things we're working on in Wisconsin, another big challenge, is how do you find that match for federal programs and for state programs? That can also be the case. And another strategy that we're using in Wisconsin and other states is a Trails partnership, which I think reflects what Yumeno mentioned earlier about how we want to expand the coalition. The more partners you work with, in my experience, the farther you can get. And I think it kind of relates to that growing the pie piece. So we've got a lot of information on our website about this, and I think Drew's going to talk a little bit more about some of the resources that are out there.
Yeah, I mean, so we just want to highlight some of the different tactics. Brian's going to talk more about specific policies after this that have worked for us and worked for some of our partners in states around the country. And I mean, there's a lot here on this list, but obviously there's a lot more in 30-something states we've worked in and that other advocates have had successes with around the country. There will be a follow-up email with linked to some of our policy work. And if you still have a question about any of these, feel free to reach out to me or Brian. Just a couple points, especially if you're new to working with the states. Every state legislature has a different website. And if you can't afford to pay for a tracking service, a lot of them do have a way to sign up and follow bills. If you know that there's a bill that relates to trail funding or a bad bill, you can often set up alerts to get or sign up to get notifications and alerts about when there's committee hearings and things like that. Somebody alluded to earlier developing legislative champions. I think that's really important, inviting them to things. You want people to really carry your water in the legislature. And it's also just about educating them ahead of an ask. Yumeno in particular talked about this. And even if they're not your biggest champion, sometimes you might be able to mitigate their opposition just by educating them about your issue ahead of time. We tend to call them advocacy days more than lobby days, just because lobbying can sometimes have a little bit of a negative connotation to some people. And if you're able to bring people and bring constituents to the State House for an advocacy day, that can really put your issue on legislators' maps. There's more expensive things you can do, or things that cost money, like paid targeted social media ads to generate emails to legislators. One time, we had a state that was where a lot of legislators were skeptical about funding biking and walking, and we commissioned a statewide poll through the flagship state university, and it really helped move the needle to show that even amongst people across party lines and rural, urban, tended to support funding for trails, biking, and walking. And yeah, like I said, if you have other questions about any of these, feel free to reach out to us. Brian?
Yeah, thanks, Drew. As we look at the next slide, I was thinking about the Trails advocacy days and something that Palmer mentioned about just her own background in land trust. And one of the things that's been really powerful with our advocacy days is having small business owners, conservancy folks, and public health, in addition to your traditional trails advocates. And it really kind of broadens the understanding and helps kind of key in on different interests of legislators. But I did want to make sure, I mentioned that the Rails-to-Trails.org website is a plethora of really great resources, which savvy people, tend to find. And we also spend a lot of time spreading the word on some of these different models. But our policy hub is one of the things, our active transportation policy hub, where we've pulled together and we continue to develop stories and other information around models that really make sense in terms of legislation, in terms of larger strategies that move your projects forward. And every year when we do our state policy webinar, we're reminded that so many people go and use that resource. And there you'll find things like the Ohio Legislative Trails Caucus story and so forth. I want to also highlight around budget because, while different states have different legislative session dates, it's always to your advantage to get into the budget as early as possible. So talking to your state agencies, talking to the governor's office and getting those in there so that they're on the radar when the legislature starts to review, makes it a lot more likely that you're going to be successful than if you wait and try to get it added in the legislative sessions around the budget. So, think early, be defined about your asks. Numbers are really good. We talked about make the case data and some of the things that you can do around that. We've also highlighted some other things here around, potential for gas taxes. Some states like Minnesota have started looking at funds for climate change. And again, that, really depends on what the structure of the legislature is or the makeup. What things are going to be easier to make the case for or more likely to succeed. But, in general, this is where, every state and, every locality for that matter, you got to kind of customize your strategy, use some of those best practices, but also, best who you're talking to. And I think that kind of highlights again that, one of the things that Rails-to-Trails Conservancy is about is building capacity and working with partners. So, while most of my focus is on the Midwest, I dabble in some other states, and Drew's around for basically the other states, working with North Carolina and so forth. So, yep. So great to talk to you, and I'm looking forward to hearing some of those questions.
Yeah, like Brian said, we'll move on to our question and answer section. I can see that we've had a lot of questions already. And Yumeno and Palmer, I hope you can join in. Just feel free to weigh in. And if you have any more questions, you can still drop them in the box. So let's see. We got a couple questions that asked about how coalitions like this get funding. Palmer, since you're leading the coalition, do you want to talk about that first?
Sure, I can jump in. I keep saying we're relatively new, and we are, and the way we're funding ourselves is with member dues. So we've asked, and we're not I don't think we're charging a ton. I mean, so we've asked people to join at a minimum of $250 up to $2,500, and the different levels have different benefits. So at the highest level at $2,500, you're eligible to serve on the executive committee. We have a whole governance document. And then at $1,000, you can be on the steering committee, and that provides you with the ability to vote on our various policies and things we do. So it's kind of a scaled membership, but that is how we're funding the work we do. That pays for the lobbyists mostly. And then as a coordinator, a little bit of money. Since so much of my time is invested in this coalition, I do get some of that covered with the dues that comes in. And again, we have a fiscal sponsor for the coalition's work. So we're not a 501c3 at this point in time.
I would maybe just add that fundraising is going to be, it does show that there is investment and support in your coalition and your group. So having that like that hard work that Palmer is doing, that looks great when you approach your representative and can show that you have been able to gain such traction through sponsorships and fundraising efforts.
Great. And I would just say, you know, having worked with Palmer, I think you all have a very structured model, and I've done a lot, really kind of in terms of the fundraising and the dues. I mean, coalitions come in all shapes and sizes, and some are less organized, don't raise dues money, but you know, then you do have problems funding things, you know, like advocacy days and other work. So obviously there's trade-offs there, but it's not one size fits all. Okay, I wanted to switch to more of a kind of a policy question, and this might be one for Brian in particular. How do you prioritize maintenance in funding? That's always a challenge.
Yeah, I'll kick that one off, and you know, if any others have something to add. So I think first of all, I feel like when I started in the role as Midwest Policy Manager 7+ years ago, you know, it was always about new construction and cutting ribbons, and that's what motivates. But what I have seen in the last several years is legislators really asking, how do we maintain what we have? And so I think that, you know, there has been a shift in, you know, that ribbon cutting mentality. And of course you can cut a ribbon on resurfacing a trail anyway. But, you know, that being said, I think a couple ways that you prioritize. Number one, Indiana and other states have set up a trail maintenance fund. I will say Indiana still needs to be funded, but that's one of the things that we're pushing, you know, right now. So that's one way to prioritize it. I think a second thing to look at with maintenance is what, you know, I think what everyone's kind of talked about is you got to get your decision makers out on the trail, and you got to get them, you know, interacting with local elected officials, with trail users and other constituents. And when they see not only those pristine parts of a trail, but also those opportunities to improve a trail or to make a connection, that can be super compelling. And then I guess the third thing I'll say is, you know, ultimately maintenance generates tax dollars just like construction does. The Recreational Trails Program, which is one of our federal funding sources, is designed to be focused on maintenance. It's not always used that way by states. And so I think that's another thing that you can advocate for, is use RTP in the way it was meant to be.
So I wanted to ask, I'm sort of combining two questions here related to lobbying. We got one question about if you all had hired lobbyists. I think Palmer mentioned it, and Brian might have, and if that was a key component and how you funded that. And then the other question also related to lobbying was, how do you do a lobby day or an advocacy day when the capital is very far away, when you're in a bigger state? So you can take one piece of that or both. Anyone? Palmer, maybe?
Yeah. So regarding forming the advocacy days, and you know, I am new to this whole world of legislative action, so it's been fun to learn. But we are going to have we'll call it an advocacy day in March, so pretty early in the legislative season. We start, I think, the third week of January, with intention to wrap up by the end of June for our long session. And so we're going to go in March and have a breakfast. We're still deciding whether or not we're launching a caucus. That is a long-term goal of ours. But we are going in with an idea of having a breakfast and inviting people to come learn about the coalition and learn about Year of the Trail. Again, we're really using this Year of the Trail opportunity to engage people because things will be happening in their districts. And then Drew, what was the other part of that?
Hiring a lobbyist.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, absolutely. From the get-go, we knew we had to hire a lobbyist. We've got a fantastic team working on our behalf. So that is why we have dues, because we have to be able to pay for that. We do communicate out to our coalition members constantly. We have monthly meetings. We have a legislative committee that meets monthly as well. So it's a pretty well organized structure, I think we have, but we wouldn't be able to do it without the lobbyists. That's essential.
Yeah, I'll jump in on two things. So the Ohio Trails Partnership that represents all the non-motorized trail treads it started a pilot this year, and we engaged a lobbyist who nicely was a former director of the Ohio Department of Natural Resources. He knows everyone, and when I go to meetings with him, it's a very different kind of interaction. You know, he is like, knows all the people, you know, is kind of like talking the game and whatnot. So if you can figure out a way to do that, and, you know, our 5-partner group was able to cobble together the money to engage him for 6 months. And I think we're going to see like a nice payoff in lame duck in Ohio and we're looking at that over the next couple weeks. I also want to like highlight specifically on the question about what do you do when you're far away from the Capitol? One of the things that the pandemic taught us is that Zoom and Teams and whatnot can be utilized in very effective ways. So, you know, I do think that in-person piece is great if you can get some of your advocates to meetings like in that way. But, you know, one of the nice things about Zoom, for example, is that you can share maps, you can like highlight other things. And so if you're innovative, you can make that interaction just as effective as being in person.
One other thing too, in terms of in-person lobby days, advocacy days, is I've seen organizations sort of provide scholarships for transportation funding so that people who have a financial need can ask for some assistance to be able to travel to the State House, you know, with the assumption that most people would fund their own way or, you know, be part of some kind of a, you know, carpooling situation. And so, you know, you'd still need to raise some money for that, but you're not paying for everybody to come. You're just paying for people who need a little extra assistance. And again, the bigger the state, I mean, again, I came from Texas, so I recognize some geographical obstacles here, but so it really just, it depends a lot on the size of the state. Okay, I'm going to try to combine another question here. We're calling it the David Goliath question. One was sort of about dealing with a recalcitrant railroad and building a rail trail, and another was about dealing with a strong entity in the state that had a lot of political power. I think it was a statewide farm group. And it says, how do you counterbalance the negative stance of other strong oppositional voices and influencers that have money and the favored attention of many key legislators? You know, so basically, how do you handle David and Goliath type situations, and how do you build political will to counteract all that influence and money? That's the $1 million question. Anyone?
I mean, I think for us, it's just broadening our partnership. So we're trying to recruit some of those Goliaths to our team. Yeah, so some of those entities that have a stronger position with our legislators, have them adopt our platform and see that it brings value to what they're trying to do in the General Assembly and to their members.
Yeah, just real quick, Palmer, you mentioned the three-legged stool involving nonprofits, industry, and local government. And I think, you know, just industry can be part of that, you know, so get them on board. Sorry, Yumeno, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's exactly right. And I think that's sort of the new area we're in. And it makes us more credible to have those three legs to the stool.
Yeah, I think I was just going to echo Palmer. I think that's a great tactic. And also just approaching every legislator with the open idea, you know, you never know if they fund one group, they're probably interested in yours too. You just got to let them know that there's a connection. Other groups connecting is also a really great way to find other opportunities for funding, such as grants and things like that. They might have had a prior grant or things that they've received that they can help you find as well. And your legislators' offices can actually help you with grant searches and if you're wondering your committee schedule to plan activities and things, your legislative offices can provide that to you.
Right.
Two quick thoughts I'll add. In Wisconsin, because every state's got a different makeup, it's very important that if we want to get traction with non-motorized trails, that we are partnering with the motorized trails, particularly the snow machine coalitions. And so, you know, I look at it as an opportunity to work on some of those conflicts and better sharing the trails. But I think that that's one aspect of, and Palmer kind of referenced it, is, you know, think about how you expand your coalition and your advocacy to work on some of those issues. It doesn't mean the individual advocacy around, you know, whether you're doing multi-use trails or hiking or mountain biking doesn't also happen. And then the other thing I wanted to highlight was that particularly the reference to, you know, that sometimes farm bureaus are maybe not as supportive of the trail work. I was at an amazing event in Indiana a couple months ago where a local farmer got up and spoke about how he became a big fan of walking, biking, and trails. And so, you know, this kind of relates back to those kind of stories. You've got those folks out there, and sometimes it's just a matter of, like, you know, talking to them and getting them to try it out.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Anybody? We just have time for one more question, and I do want to address. Is any thoughts on doing outreach and recruiting stakeholders and leaders from more diverse communities? And you know, obviously it's a really important issue. And sometimes when we're talking about money and dues and stuff and things like that, that can be an obstacle. So any thoughts on diversifying coalitions and getting around some of those financial obstacles?
Well, I think for us, with our Year of the Trail campaign, you know, we spent a lot of time talking about what our values are and what our goals are for the campaign. And a big part of that is diversity and inclusion on trails. And trails are for all, make trails welcoming to all. There are a lot of barriers to use of trails for certain groups. So trying to overcome those. So we're really trying to address that through our Year of the Trail campaign. Because there is a lot of work in that arena. I mean, the coalition itself is very focused on resources, so funding for trails. So that's the focus there. It's not so much about policy changes, but the Year of the Trail does provide an opportunity to engage and address those barriers to trail users. And actually, we've referenced Rails-to-Trails Conservancy's the linking that's just in the chat, but we've referenced that in our community toolkit as a great resource.
Representative Ingram, as the co-chair, she greatly champions the diversity of trails. Her area being an urban area, and I'm outside of Philadelphia, there's different challenges that trails have and different benefits. It can really make for a safe space and safer communities and connect people to work, and tailoring that message to your legislator in terms of diversity and how it makes your community better and your community better. That's a great thing to share with your legislator.
Great.
Yeah,
Well,
sorry.
Last point, Brian.
Just real quick, very quick. Shared leadership, very important. You know, I think a lot of times there are, like, certain people that are leading the show, and the more collaborative, the better in terms of engaging diverse groups. And I'll mention one other story, which was real quick. We were at a walking, America Walk Summit, and there was a room of over 400 people, almost entirely white. And the keynote speaker, who was a woman of color, mentioned that you need to go to where those people are, not try to bring them to where you are. And so, you know, think about the venues where you have meetings. There's a lot of things, and we're seeing that happen in Milwaukee in a really transformative way.
Okay, Thanks, Brian. That is all the time we have for today. I want to give a big thanks to our presenters, Yumeno and Palmer, for sharing their insights and experiences today. And I want to thank the hundreds of you who joined us today. And with that, we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.